Hello, my A-Push children. This is Master Instructor Chairman General Ayatollah Thorson, the benevolent dictator, coming to you live from Bunker 167. Today we are talking about Antebellum Reform and the time period before the Civil War. So let's get started. So when it comes to the first section, we're looking at the Romantic impulse. We're going to look first at art and literature. Now, with art, the Europeans pretty much thought that they were the center of the universe. They were very egocentric. They thought our stuff was kind of lame. They're like, those are nice stick figures over there. It's really nice. But our stuff is way better. So we were trying to make our name in the world, and we did so with drawing nature and looking at the awe and wonder of it. And it started with the Hudson River School. This is in New York City. Some of the famous artists at the time were Frederick Church, Thomas Cole, Thomas Doherty, Asher Durand, and they basically portrayed nature. They would paint big, gigantic images of the Hudson River Valley. Oh, the paintings are so pretty. Next, we're going to look at literature and how the early American literature basically transformed our image of, being kind of behind the Europeans. The first major, most popular author at the time was James Fenimore Cooper. He wrote several things like the Leatherstocking Tales, but he was most famous for The Deer Slayer and, of course, Last of the Mohicans. Basically, his stories were promoting westward expansion and saying how we were moving on to this great frontier. We also see some other authors that were popping up at the time. Walt Whitman, who wrote his famous Leaves of Grass poems, who spoke of liberation of the individual. We see, he also celebrated democracy. We also see Herman Melville's Moby Dick, which basically showed tragedy, but it also talked about pride and revenge. And Edgar Allan Poe's writings, including The Raven, The Telltale Heart, he wrote in basically sad language. Southern writers also changed the literature in the United States. We see, first of all, writers romanticizing the idea of the plantation and slavery and making it sound like a great thing. One of the most prominent writers during this time who did that was William Gilmore Simms. There were some other authors who we basically focused on the ordinary people and the poor whites in the South, and that would be Augustus Longstreet, Joseph Baldwin, and Johnson Hooper. Just a fun fact, Longstreet and Hooper, we're going to be seeing those names again when we look at the Civil War, just relatives of them. Also during this time period, we're seeing the Transcendentalist movement. It was just a bunch of New England writers who were focusing on reason versus understanding. Reason was basically getting your belief system and everything from your inside of you and grasping beauty and being one with your emotions, whereas understanding is basically what you would read in a book and learning through logic. Well, they pushed more for reason than understanding. How we talked about before, the way to remember this, that understanding was under them. They thought it was bad. It started in Massachusetts with Ralph Waldo Emerson. He wrote such essays as Nature and Self-Reliance, which basically called for being one with nature and one with the universe and looking to yourself in order to become the best you can be. He was a nationalist, though. He actually also wrote The American Scholar, which argued that that you could have artistic greatness and that could make you a good American as well. The other major transcendentalist at the time was Henry David Thoreau. He said people should seek self-realization not by conforming with society, but by going on their own instincts. He wrote Walden when he spent 2 years in Ralph Waldo Emerson's cabin in the woods, and basically this is when he came up with the idea of resistance to civil government, which is the idea of civil disobedience, standing up against laws that you find unjust, which we see later on being used by such great leaders as Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. The way that people defended nature at the time was simple. They're like, yeah, it's good for the economy, it's good for studying, for science, but it's really a good place to find inspiration to make you basically realize the truth within your soul. During Transcendentalism, we're also seeing the growth of utopian or communal societies in the United States. The first major one was Brook Farm. It started in Massachusetts in 1841 by George Ripley. And it was just this community that was created to, it wanted to push everybody to have their own self-realization, to have and follow their individual beings, but they also said they would have equal labor and share in all that they did, similar to Little C communism. But there was major conflicts because people joined it because they're like, yeah, I'm all about myself and I'm worried about me. Well, when it was time to work and actually do stuff to, I don't know, survive, they couldn't really get anyone to work because everyone would just want to just sit around and find their soul through nature. So people dissented, and we see one of the most famous dissenters of Brook Farm, Nathaniel Hawthorne. He wrote several different books about how communal living was wrong, like the Blithedale Romance, which basically said if you submit, it's oppression, meaning like if you submit to a community like that, and the Scarlet Letter, and I'm sure many of you have read this, which says that it basically talks about the price that you pay if you aren't a part of society. There was another group that started in New Harmony, Indiana. This was created by Robert Owen in 1825. It was meant to do kind of the same thing, but economically it failed. These communal groups actually redefine gender roles. We're seeing that a lot, and we're seeing a push of feminism. One of the most feminist leaders at the time when it came to Transcendentalists was Margaret Fuller. She was the one that wrote Women in the 19th Century with Many Feminist Ideas, and that book was actually used with the feminist movement, which we're going to look at in a little bit. There also was the different types of communities that like got rid of gender roles, like John Humphrey's Oneida community, which had the ones that sought perfection by rejecting the traditional idea where like man and wife, no one got married, no one raised their own children, everybody just raised the kids together. Okay. And Ann Lee's Shaker Society, because they shook when they prayed in church, they were the ones that got rid of, they were just like, well, no sex, completely celibate. The only way you can get in is not by having babies, is by choosing to get in. And there was equality amongst men and women, especially for the fact that A, the leader was a woman, and B, most of the members were women. Probably the most famous group at the time that was created were the Mormons. It started with Joseph Smith in upstate New York in the early 1830s. He wrote what was known as the Book of Mormon, which is their pretty much Bible, which basically was trying to find a new Jerusalem. They felt like they were going to be the ones that would bring back Christ. But because they promoted polygamy, because they were so secretive, many people feared them to the point where they had to move from New York to Missouri again, and into Illinois. Once they got to Illinois, Joseph Smith was actually killed because people feared him. And his protege, Brigham Young, made an exodus to Salt Lake City in what is now Utah, and that's where the Mormons stayed. Now, they saw it that what they pushed for was human perfectibility, not individual liberty. So because of that, they did, working together, having strong family bonds and group bonds was very important to them. And that's why they were able to last, because they were able to work together rather than just trying to be their own person like at Brook Farm. What type of people joined? Basically anybody who had nowhere else to go. That's pretty much who joined at first. During this time period, things are so rapidly changing, we're seeing a major push and reform. That's the second thing we're going to be looking at, is remaking society. The first one we're going to be looking at is more of a religious reform. We are seeing that people are upset because we're starting to see Calvinist ideas being rejected. They don't like that, and they're seeing too many people fall into Unitarianism and Universalism, and they want to bring people back to Christianity. So we see this thing called the New Light Revivalists start to become predominant in this movement at the time. They believe that every individual is capable of salvation. You weren't predestined to go anywhere. You weren't helpless, just assuming that God already picked you to go to heaven or hell, so why even try? No, you are the one that makes your own salvation. And Charles Finney was the one who really pushed this. Where did he work? Basically in the burned over districts in upstate New York. We see this huge explosion in the economy because of the Erie Canal, and people were kind of putting religion on the back burner. So he went up there hoping to make a revival. Who was he able to get to? Basically anybody who was down in the dumps because the economy hurt them, and women. Alcohol, that's what we're going to be looking at next. We're looking at the beginning of the temperance movement that's going to last for a good 80 years. Why did people push for the temperance movement, meaning the movement to ban alcohol? Because they felt that alcohol was the prime thing that caused crime, disorder, poverty, things like that. So because there were such problems in the West, that's where we start seeing this movement. It started in 1826 with the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance, And then in 1840, when we see the big move out west, and that's where we see a lot of people having troubles with alcohol, we see the Western temperance movement. But because it grew, it led to factions. The bigger things get, the more factions we know of, as James Madison would, of course, agree with. Because they couldn't decide on what to agree on. Do they ban out all alcohol, some alcohols? Do you do it by law? Do you do it by conscience, meaning like try to change people's ideals and telling them to get rid of alcohol? And then it also caused some major issues between religious groups, because it was basically the people in the temperance movement were pretty much Protestant, and they would look down on Catholics who used alcohol in religious ceremonies and didn't have a problem with alcohol, and that just caused some major religious conflicts as well at the time. During the 1830s and 40s, there was a major cholera epidemic going around, which basically if you contacted it, you had a 50-50 shot of biting it or living. And we're seeing a push for health fads, people wanting to figure out what to do, come up with different ideas of how to fix these problems. So, we see a lot of crazy ideas like water cure, hydrotherapy, uses enough water and it'll just flush it out of your system. Yes, that's how it works. We also see ideas with changing of diets, and then of course phrenology, that's the fun one, where you measure the size of your skull to decide what type of characteristics, diseases, and intelligence that you have. So next time that you're hanging out at your friend's house and you guys get bored and you're looking for something to do, get out the ruler and measure each other's heads and see how intelligent each one of you are. Let's actually look at real medical science, which is hard to do because not much of it was really going around. We had terrible technology. We had really lackluster medical schools. So basically, poorly educated people were becoming physicians, and because they really didn't have a basic knowledge of disease. Vaccination wasn't around. Anesthesia was created at time, but not on purpose. It was kind of by accident, so we got pretty lucky with that one. They weren't using things like the scientific method and experimentation to try to figure out what works and what doesn't work. They were just kind of like throwing it up there. So next time you're in class and you don't feel like science class, you don't feel like going through all those steps, just think of the style of, medical practice that was used during this time, like phrenology and water therapy. Oh, and as you remember, I would hope you can remember from a few chapters ago, the bleeding and purging that was used as well. We needed to use those scientific methods. They're kind of important, or as some writers of U.S. history believe, they're kind of a big deal. We're also seeing reform in the educational system. We're seeing this push for universal public education. We saw Thomas Jefferson want it, but not really anything being done with it until starting with now. We first start seeing a system like this in Massachusetts around 1830, because people are starting to believe that everyone has the capability to basically add and put some type of value into society, and we needed to tap that resource and make sure that we get people educated so that they can add to society. Now, the greatest reformer at the time was Horace Mann. He was the one that felt that if you have free public education, it helps with democracy, because the more intelligent we are, the more we can become democratic. We start seeing in the 1850s some tax-supported elementary schools in states, but the thing is that the quality of the teachers was widely varied. We see some states with professional, well-trained teachers that got taught in normal universities. That's the name of schools were for teachers. But we also see places where teachers are barely literate and the schools have no funding. So where did we see this happen a lot? In the West, because it was so diversely populated and the population was so dispersed that basically they really had little opportunity to get education. Of course, Southern blacks were barred from education. So overall, about 1/3 of the children in the United States are actually in school. But there were some good things that came with it. We had the highest literacy rate in the world, and then there was also help for not only students, healthy students, but those who were handicapped as well. And it also helped impose new social values into children at a younger age, which included thrift, order, discipline, punctuality, and respect for authority. At the time, the United States is also making a reform when it comes to rehabilitation. We are seeing, instead of prisons where we see the criminals and the poor and the mentally ill being thrown into it, we're starting to see asylums that are for the mentally ill separate from prisons. We're also seeing prisons change. Instead of the antiquated or old, outdated jails, they're being replaced with new penitentiaries. And also we're seeing the reform of rehabilitating inmates. There's this rigorous and rigid discipline that's using to curb the laxness and the laziness of prisoners, trying to make them more structured and part of society. They also try to throw in solitary confinement so you could just sit and think about what you've done wrong. But overcrowding is becoming a major problem. There's also basically a way to help. We're seeing orphanages, we're seeing homeless shelters for the poor, and homes for friendless women, who are basically women who aren't married. As of Indians at the time, the reform movement actually led to the idea of the Indian reservation, where they are isolated from white society, because they wanted to do this. Number one, they were looking out for the economic interests of the whites. It's if they put them on the bad land, whites have good land to farm off of. But they also wanted to teach them how to be civilized. So like we talked about in class, assimilation is the idea where you join groups together, blend a group that's not part of American society into society. So naturally, the logical way to do that is to separate them from white society, because that would lead to assimilation. This is also the first time we're going to see the rise of feminism in the United States in the 1830s and 1840s. Women were trying to fight their traditional roles that they had to play, of them staying at home and rearing the children while the husbands would go off and work. Well, there are major resentments over these limitations. So we're starting to see the rise of the feminist movement with many major names, like the Gumke sisters. We see the Stowe sisters, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Dorothea Dix. We're seeing them starting to draw connections between, they were abolitionists, that movement, and women's movements. Like, if we're trying to free the slave population, we should be freed from these limitations that are being put upon us as well. So they organized a convention in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, where they created their manifesto known as the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. And it basically stated, like similar, taking on from the Declaration of Independence, that all men and women are created equal, and it called for women's suffrage, or the right to vote, which we won't see until 1920. Most of the women that were there were Quakers, because Quakers already believed in sexual equality. It was limited, though, during the antebellum years, because there were very few women who actually had high position careers, like physicians and ministers. But they did associate with other reform movements at the time, like abolitionism, so they used that to kind of propel themselves. But at the same time, the women's movement was looked as secondary to the abolition movement in the United States. That was really the big movement at the time. The third and final thing we're going to be looking at today is the crusade against slavery, abolitionism. The early opposition started with the American Colonization Society around the 1820s, where it was the idea by Virginians who opposed slavery to buy back all the slaves and send them back to Africa, to the country of Liberia. Well, that's one of those things that's not really going to work. First of all, it's weird. But second of all, let's look at the logistics of it. It's too expensive. They couldn't get enough money to do it. Slave owners were not willing to sell back their slaves to do this. And it was a matter of getting also free black men and women back to Africa as well. And they weren't going to agree to that. So the movement lost strength for several reasons. It wasn't viable. This idea of setting up a colony there was not viable. It just didn't work logistically. And because of King Cotton exploding in the 1830s, no one wanted to get rid of slavery in the South. In fact, they wanted it even more. One of the biggest proponents of abolitionism was William Lloyd Garrison. He was employed in an anti-slavery newspaper, which was known as the Genius of Universal Emancipation, but he was really impatient with its moderate tone. He was much more radical when it came to the idea of emancipation. So he went and found his own newspaper, the Liberator, in 1831, and he said, stop looking at how this is going to hurt white society. Let's look at it through the eyes of the slaves and the black people. Things are bad. We need to make sure that if we were in their shoes, what would we want? We would want immediate freedom, and we would want full rights as American citizens, which is why he rejected gradualism. So he founded a group during this time called the New England Anti-Slavery Society in 1832, but it got some clout and it became the American Anti-Slavery Society because membership grew so rapidly because they agreed with him. Why was this able to happen? Well, because there were so many people at the time that wanted social change and reform and things done for the better that they got on board with this idea pretty quickly. At the time, of course, too, there were also black abolitionists, free blacks in the South who promoted abolitionism. Abolitionism appealed to many northern free blacks for several reasons. Number one, they were poor, they had little access to education, suffered major mob violence, and if they had jobs, they were pretty menial. And they realized that the reason that all of this was happening because they were tied to the institution of slavery. People thought of slavery, that's how they should be treated, so because it existed, they got treated poorly too. Some of the people, black abolitionists at the time, that were spouting these ideas and letting people know about this were David Walker. He was more violent, very Malcolm X-like with his rhetoric when he spoke, like the idea of slitting the slave owners' throats, and if they don't kill, they're going to be killed. But most blacks did have less violent speech. Another leader, a woman at the time, Sojourner Truth, she became an anti-slavery spokeswoman for the abolition movement. But probably the greatest abolitionist, in fact, it is the greatest abolitionist at the time, would be Frederick Douglass. He escaped slavery, moved to New England, went to England to kind of get more ideas about abolitionism, came back to the United States and lectured throughout New England and the North about abolitionism. He wrote for a newspaper, the North Star. He created his own autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And with his ideals, he demanded freedom, but he also wanted social and economic equality. But he wanted it in a more peaceful way, very much so like Martin Luther King wanted equality peacefully in the 1950s and 60s. They, at the same time, had an anti-abolitionist movement as well. White Southerners and some white Northerners opposed abolition. They felt that it was a threat to the social system. It feared that people also feel that it might lead to sectionalism and influx of blacks moving to the North, taking white people jobs. There was violence against abolitionists. One of the major examples of that would be the attack on the abolitionist headquarters, the Temple of Liberty in Philadelphia, and it was burned to the ground, and William Lloyd Garrison was captured and seized at the time by anti-abolitionist movement. But overall, the movement did grow despite this group that basically was an enemy of them, and basically it showed that no matter what happened to them, their members were strong-willed, they were passionate about what they were doing, they weren't going to back down, and it gave them great courage and moral strength, and it gave others strength to want to join the movement as well. But overall, they were a small percentage of the population. Majority of the people were very ambivalent towards slavery. They could care either way. Like I was saying before with J-Mads, as something grows, we're going to see more factions, and we see factions among the abolitionist movement in the 1830s. Because of the anti-abolitionist violence, we're starting to see people with many different views. We see William Lloyd Garrison saying we need to do this rapidly, we need to take care of this now, we need full equality for African Americans and women, no more fighting, we need to get rid of the South, we just need to get away from them. And then there's moderates that are like, no, we just need to persuade the South that slavery is bad, like that's going to happen. But there's other things that are happening during this time too that are good for the abolitionists. Like in 1839, when the ship the Amistad was seized by slaves going from Africa to Cuba, the United States seized it. They were able to, the Supreme Court decided to send the Africans back and declared them free. So that was good for abolitionists. Prigg versus Pennsylvania, it said that states can't really enforce the fugitive slave laws, so that was a good win for the abolitionists as well. Now, the national government did pressure to abolish slavery in areas of federal jurisdiction, and they were trying to prohibit interstate slave trade, like trading, for instance, a slave from Louisiana to Texas. But it was never really enforced. There was also political parties that were coming around pushing for the free soil movement, which is the idea of not allowing slavery to spread to new areas, new territories that could become states. There were some abolitionists that showed the violence through books, like with the American Slavery as It Is. But the most powerful abolitionist propaganda at the time was Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom Cabin, which combined the idea of a novel, so people could like get the sentimental feel of a novel, but learning about slavery at the time. And with this, we start seeing this idea spread across the country of abolitionism, because everybody's reading this book at the time. I've talked about this before. Abraham Lincoln called Harriet Beecher Stowe the little lady who started the big war, because people started really getting upset over not only slavery but the expansion of it. All right, next chapter we're going to look about how our nation eventually becomes divided and leads to the Civil War. This is Thorson Horch.